Hi everybody, I'm Igor Minár, and I come here at Google, and I'm going to talk to you about AngularJS. How many of you know about AngularJS? Okay, a few minutes. I have some t-shirts for you, so stick around. What we do with AngularJS, we help you reimagine what a browser is and how you can use it when you're building web applications. So I guess everybody here knows what a browser is, right? Yes? Yeah, come on. Yes, we know what browsers are. We use them every day. But how many of you remember when browsers looked something like this? No? Few hands? Okay, good. I like this audience. So it wasn't that long ago. And when you think about it, the browsers were built to display something very simple. Simple content, very static, and at the time was very boring, unless you were a researcher and you were into research papers. So when you look at the browsers today, they look a lot different. They are more advanced, and more importantly, the content they display or they give us access to is a lot more interactive, and a lot more rich, and also more advanced. So we spent all our days, doing emailing, calendaring, whatever you have in the browser. And I never would have thought, but today we can have a full-blown IDE in the browser. Who thought that this would be possible? Not me, but Cloud9 proved me wrong, so this is amazing. So as a user, I feel really good about the current state of affairs. There is a lot of content, the browsers are pretty advanced, things are snappy, but I can't say the same thing as a developer. I'm not so happy, because to build these really advanced and rich applications, there is a lot of complexity that I have to fight. And as you probably know, complexity kills innovation, and complexity kills creativity. And it's this barrier between you and the user you're trying to build this awesome app for. Well, what do I mean by complexity? You probably know, but let's have a simple look at a quick look at a simple code. I'm building a Hello World application or static page, first in HTML and then in JavaScript. So HTML is what the browsers were originally built for, and it's super easy to do Hello World. You just say, hey browser, please render a paragraph, and set the content of this paragraph to be Hello World. Notice this is a declarative description of the end result. This is not how you do it. I don't care. Browsers will figure out how to render this. Let's compare this to a JavaScript version of the same application. I'm not going to go over this crazy code, but it should suffice to say that this is one of the ugliest Hello World examples of history in the history of programming languages. And if you look quickly at the code, you see that the developer has to understand how browsers work, what kind of events are fired, how to register listeners for these events, how to respond to events and do DOM manipulation, and also how to work around various differences between browsers. But worst of all, this is not a declarative description of the end result. This is a sequence of steps that the browser has to take in order to get to the displaying Hello World. Now, I used to build applications in this way, and I always felt like I was dealing with black magic. Like I was tricking the browser into doing something rather than having it help me in building these applications. Anybody here remembers how we used to do rounded corners before we had border radius? 1, 2, 3 hands? Really? Just 4 hands? Come on, all these nested divs and the background images. No, that was just crazy. That was this tricking of the browser. And CSS has improved a lot. Unfortunately, I don't see the same kind of improvements being done in HTML and DOM. But you might want to say, hey, I use jQuery, I use Clojure, I don't deal with browser inconsistencies, and the APIs are pretty sane. Well, unfortunately, we are still dealing with the imperative way of building applications. And when you think about it, these tools, these libraries, they shouldn't have existed if the browser APIs were sane and were implemented consistently across all the browsers. The solution I'm looking for is declarative. Just like we had the Hello World in static HTML, but something suitable for web applications. And it turns out that data binding and declarative templating is quite a good answer to that. So if you have WPF or Flex background, you know a lot about data binding. But for those that you don't, it's very simple. You have a model, which is something domain-specific to application. This is where your data is. You bind the model to a template, and you let the templating engine render a view. You can bind the same model to multiple templates and render multiple views. That's totally fine. But the important thing is that this is not a one-time interpolation. This is not take this data, merge it with the template, and you're done. No. The templating engine will create this living beast that will automatically update every time you change the model. So if I start changing my model and if I change the name or image source,
the view will automatically update for me. And also, if you have two-way data binding, like I have in the second example with the form, if the user starts interacting with the view by just clicking or adding stuff to the form, this will propagate directly to the model automatically without me having to do anything. And if I have multiple views bound to the same model, these changes will then propagate to these other views. So what you get out of this is this spreadsheet-like updates. Just like in spreadsheet, you have cells and formulas that depends on each other, and everything just recalculates. You get the same thing with data binding. And this can get even more interesting when you do something more advanced, like you have a collection, and you bind this collection to a template through repeating construct. So what you're telling the templating engine is, hey, iterate over this collection, stamp out as many copies of the template as necessary for each of the elements, and then bind each element in the collection to this copy of the template. And the end result is you have a list. And in this case, I have a list of superheroes. And again, this is a living beast. When you start pushing new superheroes into the collection, these superheroes will just appear in the list automatically. The same thing with you delete or if you update. So this data binding can really remove a lot of JavaScript code from your application. Because if you think about it, most of the code in client-side web applications is really just about watching the model or figuring out when the model changes and then pushing the changes to the view through this very tedious DOM manipulation, registering listeners and that kind of stuff. So we thought we could do better. We could teach the browser how to do data binding. And this is what AngularJS does. This is one of the features. We implemented it using JavaScript, and it's available in all the browsers, including IE8 and mobile browsers today. But we think that data binding is so cool that it should be a fundamental part of the platform. And that's why we're working with teams and Chrome and other vendors, browser vendors, on a specification called model-driven views. And what the specification tries to do is to bring data binding or primitives necessary for data binding directly into the browser, so the browsers just know how to do data binding. This is going to be available in the future. If you like data binding, you can start using it with AngularJS today. So while data binding really removes a lot of JavaScript code from your application, what about HTML? Because HTML itself can be verbose as well. People know Bootstrap, Twitter Bootstrap here? I would hope so. Yeah, I love it. It allows you to just take CSS and HTML and make it beautiful by default. One of the components they give you is these tabs. But unfortunately, if I want to render these tabs, I have to go to the documentation, and I have to copy-paste this chunk of HTML, put it into my application, and then find where I need to insert my data. And what I get is 2 tabs rendered. Well, I feel like I'm tricking the browser again. Because what I'm doing is I'm not telling the browser to render tabs. I'm telling the browser, render all these divs and LIs and spans, and just by chance, it looks like a tab. Wouldn't it be better if I could just, in my application, my HTML file, say, hey, browser, render tabs, and put 2 panes into these tabs, and each pane should have some content and some title. And I don't care what HTML structure exists to display this as a tab. You figure it out. And this is something we'll allow you to do with AngularJS. We call these things reusable components, and it's not just about tabs. We allow you to build these components for your application. And just think about the possibilities. Every time you're doing something where you repeat a chunk of HTML, you could turn this into a reusable component. And these components can be simple or complicated. It really depends on your needs. So what we did is we took existing DOM and JavaScript APIs and made this possible. And it works, again, across all the browsers, including IE8 mobile browsers. But we thought this should be part of the platform. So we are working on a specification called Web Components. This is something that is already being implemented in Chrome and WebKit. And what the specification aims to do is make it possible to build custom components and bring other very powerful platform primitives that we don't have and we can do without in the future. So Angular is not just about data binding and this reusable components. It's really a full stack of what is there missing in the browser to build web applications. We take the best pieces of HTML and best pieces of JavaScript and fill in the gaps where necessary in a way that it feels like you're using a smarter browser. And let's just see some coding, because just talking about slides is boring. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a simple to-do app application. Seems that to-do apps are hot these days, so let's just build one. What I have here is just static HTML. This file is in index.html. I have a static HTTP server that there's no server-side preprocessing. All it does, it takes files from the file system and displays them in the browser. And in this index.html, all I have is just plain old HTML. I'm loading some Twitter Bootstrap CSS, some custom CSS. I'm loading AngularJS, but it's inactive because I need to tell Angular to start doing something before it activates. And I have some custom to-do.js, which we'll use in the future. Everything else is static. So what you see is just a list of tasks and an empty form that doesn't do anything. So I said data binding is awesome, so maybe I should be able to do something like this. Well, if I do it, you just see the raw template. And this is because browsers don't know how to do data binding. But Angular can teach the browser how to do data binding. So what I can do is I activate Angular just by placing ng-app, this custom attribute, somewhere in my HTML. And this somewhere is the root of the application. So you can actually have an Angular application living inside of an existing application. If you have round-trip applications, for example, and you just want Angular for a form or some part of the application, you can do that. So I just tell Angular this is an Angular application, and it starts compiling the HTML for me automatically on the fly. And what you see is that the name disappeared. And that's because Angular doesn't know what the model is. Model is currently empty. So how would I tell what this model is? I need to define some context. And this context is defined through a controller. So let's define a controller. So everything within the body, or in your application can be other element, is going to be controlled by this application controller. Okay, but this controller also has to live somewhere. And we have a module system in Angular, so we're going to say that this is going to live in a to-do app. Okay, that's better. Let's go to to-do.js. What I have here already is I have the module defined, so I'm just saying we have a to-do app module. And within this module, we have a controller defined, and this controller is app controller. And the controller is defined through a constructor function, which takes one argument called scope. Think of scope as a context that is shared between the controller and the template, and anything available on this scope, in this object, is then available to templating. So what I can do is I can just say scope.username equals Igor. If I save, Angular just finds the model and it automatically pulls it out and pushes it into the template. Okay, that's pretty good. What about this static list that we have here? So we have this list, a bunch of LIs. I really need just one because I want to define a template that will be then reused for all of the elements. Okay, so I remove all of this stuff. But before I can iterate over anything, I need to define this model. So let's say we have items, which is just an array, which contains plain old objects. So plain old array with objects, and each object has a text property, and done property, and minion property, because I need some help to get all this stuff done. So now what I can say, I need to publish this model. I could do this in one line, but I'm just making it easier for you to read the code. I can go back to my template, and I can say, hey, repeat over the array, and we have this custom element called ngRepeat. Oops. You can use data dash if you really care about validation. That's totally fine. We recognize both syntaxes. And I can just do item in items. So if I go back to my application now, you see that I have two LIs, even though in my HTML I have just one. This is because Angular is starting to iterate over the collection. Let's make it this smaller so that we can see both. And I want to actually show the task. So because of the text property in my model, I can just say item.text, and this will display the task that is in my model. Okay, that's pretty good. We also know that I need a minion, and the minion's name is going to be displayed right here, but the image is still static. What about this image? Well, let's go to the input box first. So we have item.done, which is the state of the task. We can display it right now, so it's false or true. But this input box doesn't really reflect this state. So if I do anything, it's inactive. That's because it's not data bound. We need to establish two-way data binding. And the way we do it, we take ng model, and we say, bind this checkbox to item.done. And now when I refresh, we see that the second checkbox is already checked. And when I uncheck it, you see that the model is changed automatically, and also the binding that is bound and that is pointing to the same model automatically updates. Okay, that's pretty cool. So let's kill this. I don't need it. What about this image? So right now it's static, and we know that we have item.minion. This is where the name comes from, but we need to convert it into URL. So we can use filters. I can say avatar URL. And right now it's broken because we haven't defined what this URL is, what this filter is. So I can just do add a new filter to my module. And this is what the filter looks like. So we're just defining avatar URL, and it's just a simple function that takes some input and interpolates it with some strings and then returns the output. Okay, let's save this. Okay, much better. So we have two images that depend on a model. What about these counters? So in my HTML, I just have placeholders here. What do you think I should bind to in order to get the current count, the length of the array? Length of the array? Maybe items.length? Awesome. So that worked because native array has a property that's automatically updated every time you add or remove stuff from the array. So we can data bind to it. But what about this remaining? The native array knows nothing about how to calculate stuff that is done or not done. So, sorry?
It's just a filter.
It's just a filter?
Well, you need to filter out.
I need to calculate it. So I need to calculate how many items are done or not done. So what I can do is I can create this computed property, and I'm going to define it as a function. And when I save it, actually works because I implemented it already. So if you look at the controller, what we are doing, we are on the scope, we are just publishing this function under the name remaining, and all it does, it just iterates over this items array using the native reduce function that was added in ECMAScript 5, I think, and it will just return the count, the number of items that are done or not done. So let's see what happens if I check or uncheck the box. See, the count updates automatically for me. That's nice. But what about binding to attributes? So we see how we can bind to the text property of DOM elements. Can I make this item crossed when it's done? So I can actually say bind to the class attribute and put in class done dash true or done false item.done. And it just works, because what Angular will do, it will look at the model and will set the class to be done-true or done-false. And then in our CSS, we can just say, hey, when you have done-true class defined anywhere, just change the color and the text decoration, and you just get this visual effect. Alrighty. What about adding stuff to the form? So we have, to the list, we have this form that is static and doesn't do anything. We've already seen how to do data binding. So I'm just going to use this ng model again. I'm just going to say bind this input box to new item.text. And I can actually display it right away just to see what it looks like. Hello there. So as soon as I type, the model will be updated. And because I have the second binding, that will be updated as well. Alrighty. What about this select box? We have ng model new item.minion. Perfect. But now the button doesn't do it. Sorry? Oh, thanks. It doesn't do anything because we don't have any way of telling Angular or in our application that something should happen when the button is clicked. So in Angular, you can just say ng click or lick and pass in the new item. Now you might be surprised, ng click, doesn't this look like onClick? Well, it's very different. OnClick suffers from several problems. One of them is that it always executes in the global context. So anything that you want to invoke from OnClick has to live on window, which is just horrible. This is not a problem with ngClick. It evaluates always in the context that we define in the controller, so you don't have the global namespace problem. Also, there are no security problems because these expressions that we can invoke are very limited and are interpreted rather than evaled. And lastly, we don't put too much logic into this. It really just hooks into the controller, and all the logic should be defined in the controller. So let's look how this done add method is implemented. So in the controller, I have, again, I'm on the scope. I'm just publishing the add function. And what this function does, it just takes the new item, sets the text, creates a new object, and sets the text property to new item.text, sets the dump property to false, and I actually need minion here. New item.minion. And then we're just going to push it to this array that we already have. And at the end, we're going to set the text to be empty string. So notice this is to empty the input box after we submit the form. You are not going to reset the input box, the DOM element. You're just changing the model, and the model will then drive the view. Alrighty, so if I didn't screw up, this should work. I did screw up somewhere. Look at that. Sorry? Oh, yeah. Thanks. Okay, that works. Thank you. Okay, so we are able to add stuff into an array, but this button is always available. How about we disable it when there's nothing in a form, so that, how about we just add some validation? So we can just say HTML already has required attribute, so we can just say, hey, this input is required, as also this input is required. And now I can say disable this button through ng disabled when this form is invalid. This form doesn't have a name right now, so let's call it something. Let's call it new item form. And we'll say new item form $invalid. This is a property that is automatically updated every time the validation constraints change or the state of validation constraints change in a form. So as you see, by default, the button is disabled. When I start typing hello and pick something, the button is enabled. Now I can submit the form. And once I submit it, the button is already disabled. Okay, so this is very simple form validation. How about taking this and copy pasting it up here so that I want to display my avatar at the heading. I could just copy paste it, but this is just horrible. This is not how you should do programming. You should not repeat yourself. So what about creating a reusable component that we can just use in our application? What I'm going to do is I'm just going to take all of this. I'm just going to say I want a custom element called avatar, and I'm going to bind it to item.minion. Alrighty. So browser doesn't know what avatar looks like or what it should do with it, but I can define it in Angular. The API for that is directive. And then what I'm doing here is I'm saying within this module and within my application, I have a custom element called avatar. It's available as an element, and it takes some input as a username, and also it's backed by some templates. So whenever you come across this custom element, just take this definition, inline this template, and data bind things, wire things properly so that everything just works. Oops. Let's save this. Oh, and it works again. So now I should be able to just go back to my HTML and replace the username with avatar user-name equals, and here it's username because it's a different model. And that, voila, it works. So this is as much as I can show you with Angular. These are just some of the cool templating bits. I didn't really get into all the cool pieces. We have dependency injection that helps you break your application down into smaller pieces and make testing really easy. We really think that in order to build big applications with Angular, you need to make it possible to test them easily and encourage people to test. So we go out of our way to think about how to make applications testable. And if you look at the controller, you see there is no presentation logic in the controller. It's really just about business logic. And business logic that is completely separated from the presentation logic is easier to test. It's very easy to test. And with dependency injection, something that I didn't get to, you can easily mock out dependencies. So let's say if I had persistence implemented in this application, I could just mock out all the calls to the server and just test the business logic without worrying about spinning up a server. And it just works. So if you want to learn more about Angular, I encourage you to go to our website, angularjs.org. We have a ton of examples about these core concepts and why they are there and how they work. You can just go through examples and see all these pretty annotations, look at screenshots of or screencasts of how we build these small applications. If you wonder who uses AngularJS, Google is a big user. We have DoubleClick. DoubleClick is a big chunk of Google that deals with advertising agencies, and they build this major enterprise B2B application using Angular. Also, YouTube on PS3, if you have PlayStation 3 and you use YouTube application, that's an Angular application. There is a ton of other applications that use Angular. If you want to see some better examples of bigger applications, typical, like to-do application is not very representative of what you typically can build with Angular. We built a workshop application that I'll tweet or Google Plus links to. You can check them out. And Angular is really the sweet spot is CRUD applications. Applications that go to the database, pull data out, display them to the user, let the user change this data, and then save it back to the server. With that, we have some 2 minutes or so for questions. So please ask questions. I have a ton of T-shirts here that I would like to give away. So whoever has a good question will get a T-shirt. Go ahead.
What's the roadmap for the next release?
So we are taking a productivity hit right now because we are trying to all these conferences and talking to people about Angular. The roadmap is we want to add a bunch of features, basically just incremental updates, but we're also working on Angular 2.0, which the main feature will be server-side pre-rendering. We want to make it possible to be able to use same template on the server side as well as on the client side, and just pre-render HTML, and then in runtime, when the HTML is loaded and JavaScript is loaded, just cling to this HTML and just continue doing all the data binding. So this is one of the goals for Angular 2.0.
Do you have any plans of when the release will be?
The 2.0, it's going to take a while. It's next year, if we are lucky, because it's a really complex beast. But we already have prototypes that show that this will work. We just need to, make it production ready. Back there?
Can you say a bit more about the technical side of data binding, how it's implemented?
Sorry? How is data binding implemented?
Yeah.
That's a very good question. How do we know when the data changes? And what we do is we have this very smart dirt checking that is quite efficient. And we basically, what we do is we look at the model, but only the model that is currently bound to the view, and we run over all the expressions and see what's changed. And the question is, when do we do this? How often? We don't do any kind of polling. We just intercept events that could change the model. And when these events happen, that's when we go and dirt check the model. So it turns out that in many cases, this is more efficient than other approaches that we've seen. But we don't think that this is a long-term solution. So we are working, as I mentioned, with the specification, with guys who build specifications. And we want to get object observation into the browser so that the browser can just tell us, hey, this array changed, go do something. So this is a long-term strategy.
Okay, so do you change the document node, or do you just render the whole template when you are done?
We actually do a very fine-grained DOM manipulation. So when you do data binding, we update only that little piece that you bound to. Mm-hmm. Other questions?
When will it be possible to compile Angular apps with Google Color?
So with Angular 2.0, that's one of the goals. We already know how to do it, and we're working on it. So you can do it today, but not with all the advanced optimizations. You can do it with basic optimizations, which we often find out, but some people want advanced optimizations, so Angular 2.0.
I have a question also about the data binding. How do you know which events could change an object? That's like.
Can you just throw 2 shirts? So how do we know which events change the model? So whenever you use ng-click or any of our APIs, we know that you want to do something that could change the model. So at the end of the evaluating or interpreting the expression, we will do the dirt checking. If you don't use our APIs, we have an API that you can tell us, hey, go do dirt checking, and then we'll just check it.
Right on.
Other questions? Just shout out.
Is there any way to move the validation from the view to some kind of model?
You could do it, but what we find that typically you can make the model invalid only through the view. So we find that it's a good approach.
Yeah, I'm asking because sometimes you have like more places where you can.
Then you could create a custom element that will just data bind and that will have all this validation. So we'll have a form. You can create a reusable form. Yeah, I'm out of time. So you can find me. You can find me around. And I have a box of T-shirts. So just come and get them.
From now on, we set up